Would you dare enter the world of the undead? Venture to the island where Dracula lies buried.
There's no question in my mind that vampires inhabit this earth today.
To the city where grave robbers traded corpses for gold.
They would break open the lid of the coffin and then they would hook out the body.
To the church, which is decorated with human body parts.
After a while, they just ran out of space to store the bones.
Or to the desert where they torched the body of a rock star.
The body didn't actually burn, it exploded.
The truth can be stranger than fiction, scarier too. Since the very dawn of civilization, since humankind evolved from the lawless imperative of kill or be killed, a key attribute which marks us out as human beings is our respect for the dead. So why sometimes do we fail to show that respect? Is it because respect can turn into fear? Is that why civilized behavior turns to savagery? Why respectable, God-fearing Americans, a little more than a century ago, turned into a bloodthirsty mob, disturbing graves in their hunt for a vampire.
They took her out of the casket, and then they cut her heart out. It was blood, fresh blood.
Rhode Island, one of the most beautiful, most tranquil stretches of the New England seaboard. Today, it's a haven for nature lovers, for pleasure seekers of all kinds. But not that long ago, in this same peaceful part of the world, it was wise to be indoors come nightfall.
Rhode Island is a hotbed of vampire activity. I've documented about 20 cases in at least a 100-year span of vampire activity in New England.
Signs of the most astonishing case of vampire activity are still to be seen in this churchyard in Exeter, Rhode Island. Many still believe that this is the grave of a vampire. The Brown family were farmers. They were churchgoers, a close-knit family.
There was George Brown, the father, and Mary E., his wife, 2 daughters, Mary Olive Brown and Mercy Lena Brown, and 1 son, Edwin A. Brown.
But one by one, they began to die. The mother died in 1883.
In mid-1884, the daughter, Mary Olive, passed away.
I think it was tuberculosis that was going around, an epidemic that everybody was catching.
Mercy Lena had contracted the disease, and it progressed very rapidly. She died in January of 1892. And then Edwin started showing the signs of tuberculosis.
Could the father bear to see his son, the last of his family, simply fade away? What if the invisible killer wasn't a disease, but something far more sinister?
Some friends and members of the family went to the medical examiner for Exeter. They said that they think maybe one of the family members was housing a demon or some other sort of a supernatural creature that was sapping the life out of the living. And they told him about the ritual that they wanted to undertake and said, "We're going to do this." and we want you to be there as the medical examiner. And so he agreed to be at the scene.
They came by night, torchlight flickering over the gravestones. The villagers' faces lit also by hope that they'd put an end to the terrible spate of deaths. They seemed to have no fear of the horrible task ahead or what they might find.
They exhumed the body of George Brown's wife. They found that she was nothing but a skeleton. And they exhumed Mary Olive, the first daughter who had died. And she apparently had hair still on her skull, but nothing else, no flesh. And then they exhumed the body of Mercy Lena.
When they opened the casket up, she was not laying on her back as she was buried. She was laying on her side.
She looked like she was still fresh. In fact, like she might not even be totally dead. They had to examine her heart, which meant they had to cut open her chest.
Good. Get out.
And they found what they thought was fresh blood inside her heart. There was blood that was in liquid form inside the heart, which astonished them.
What's in the heart?
They decided she was the one.
The fresh blood in Mercy Brown's heart was the evidence they were looking for. They believed they'd found the vampire. A fire was built on a small rock close to the grave, and the bleeding heart was consigned to the flames.
And if that's not strange enough, what they did next was take the ashes, mix them in water, and then feed them to Edwin in the hopes that this would somehow affect a cure.
Would this extraordinary medicine, the ground-up ashes of his sister's heart, save the boy? If a vampire was to blame, it seems the torchlight ritual had failed. But is that what she was? A vampire? Descendants recall family stories from those who were there on that fateful night.
Reuben Brown, who passed away a few years back, he stated that there was teeth marks in the neck. There was some pierced holes in the neck. He made the statement. I was there when I heard him say it.
Do I think Mercy Brown was a vampire? No, I don't think so. She was a scapegoat. She absorbed the ignorance of the community, since they didn't understand why people were dying, and they had to find an answer. And they did what everybody in the world has done since time began, and that is blame the dead for death.
Vampire or victim? The story of Mercy Lena Brown is one of those legends which refuses to die. Her grave is a magnet for believers in the supernatural. But what draws these visitors? Some leave small tributes, flowers maybe, or a few coins at her grave. Others have darker motives. Her tombstone was stolen in recent years. It was recovered, but now it's shackled, held firmly in place with heavy steel bands to deter thieves. And nearby, another reminder of those extraordinary events. The stone where they burn young Mercy's heart can still be seen close by her grave. What happened in Rhode Island took place more than a century ago. Was the quest for a vampire merely the fruit of ignorance, superstition in a pre-scientific age? let's look at events at a graveyard in England, in London, in more modern times.
There is no question that in the case of this particular infestation, I and my colleagues were dealing with what is vulgarly described as a vampire.
This is the popular image of the vampire. And where would B-movies be without them?
Dracula the terrifying, the feared, who sleeps in the tombs of the dead by day and arises at night.
But this man claims he's not only seen a real vampire face to face, he says he's killed one using the vampire hunter's kit, which he carries around like a medic. The crucifix to ward off evil, the holy water, and most important, the sharpened stakes ready to be driven through the vampire's heart. Sean Manchester describes himself as a vampire hunter. His most famous case happened here. One of London's principal cemeteries is here, in Highgate. Generations of the capital's dead citizens lie behind these iron bars and spiked railings. But why the security? Is it to keep people out? Or to keep something else in? In 1970, vampire mania struck this part of London. A girl living near Highgate Cemetery claimed she'd been attacked in her bed by a vampire and showed marks on her neck as evidence.
There was such pandemonium in the area, such concern, such fear, that it was absolutely necessary for some positive action to be taken.
Sean Manchester made a search of the cemetery vaults. Inside one, he found something very unusual.
A large black casket, quite different to the rest, bearing no nameplate, and clearly not intended to be in the family tomb, as confirmed by the family themselves, who still lived in North London.
Without venturing in, the vampire hunter decided to attempt an exorcism.
I conducted a traditional Latin ritual at the mouth of the tomb that was suspected of harboring the vampiric pestilence. It proved ineffective and didn't halt the hauntings in the area.
It was 4 years later that he was called back, this time to a derelict mansion close by the cemetery, to investigate further. In a dark, dank cellar, a familiar-looking casket had been found.
This was the same casket that had been discovered in Highgate Cemetery. I discovered what appeared to be possibly a 3 to 5 day old corpse. It was stinking and gorged with blood that still adhered to the mouth area. This time, I did not hesitate to impale the undead heart of this vampiric creature. My assistant, meanwhile, in very difficult circumstances, managed to run off several frames of 35mm panchromatic film.
This, he claims, is the face of the vampire.
This filthy, demonic vampire was set alight, leaving a black pile of scorched dust, which was cast to the four winds.
How do you destroy a fiend who has so far proven himself indestructible?
Fact? Or like in those B-movies, pure fantasy?
Over the centuries, few people doubted the existence of such things. There's no question in my mind that vampires inhabit this earth today. Just because people refuse to believe in them hasn't in any way at all ensured their departure.
Why do legends of the undead have such a hold on our imagination? What is the lifeblood that has fed the vampire myth for centuries? Perhaps a journey to Dracula's grave, set on an island in Eastern Europe, may hold the answer. Was the real Dracula quite so bloodthirsty as the legends would suggest? He was a prince from Transylvania, in what is now Romania. They called him Vlad Dracul, Vlad the Impaler. Modern-day Romanians call this 15th century ruler a hero for his victories against the invading Turkish army. But he was also capable of unspeakable cruelty, impaling enemies on stakes to ensure a slow death. Often he'd enjoy a banquet as his victims writhed in agony close by. Accounts of Vlad's savagery spread right across medieval Europe, creating an enduring legend which writers and filmmakers adapted to produce Dracula, the vampire. And Dracula's grave? It really does exist, though it's hard to get to. Set on a small island in the middle of Lake Snagov, just north of the Romanian capital, Bucharest. He's buried inside this chapel. Beneath this heavy stone slab lies the body of the real Dracula. The prince's grave is surrounded by fading frescoes, which once marked this out as the resting place for a national hero. One which the Romanians have set about restoring to its former glory. Whatever the truth of the vampire myth, at this gravesite, the Dracula legend is alive and well. For the descendants of his loyal subjects, Dracula's sins of the past have been forgiven. Though his taste for blood will surely never be forgotten. Killers who showed no respect for the living sometimes get paid back in kind once they're dead. Here's one of them, a notorious murderer whose name lives on through the centuries, and whose skeleton is preserved as a reminder, perhaps a warning to future generations.
When he was executed, it was said that the audience numbered at least 20,000.
Meet history's most notorious body snatcher, William Burke. Scotland's capital, Edinburgh. The city they call the Athens of the North is a favorite with tourists. But for hundreds of years, it's also been a center of learning. Since the 17th century, students have flocked here, and especially medical students. But the surgeons teaching anatomy class at Edinburgh medical schools had one major problem.
British law at that time forbade cadavers to be used except if they were from executed criminals. So enterprising people would exhume bodies that were recently buried, take them back to the medical schools, and it actually became quite a formidable trade. I mean, people were actually able to make their living at this.
And that's why Edinburgh graveyards, even today, look a little like fortresses. Sentries armed with swords and muskets were posted in watchtowers like this one to keep a lookout for body snatchers. But with money to be made, professional grave robbers were willing to even risk being shot.
The grave robbers became so good that they could, within the space it took for a sentry to walk one time around a cemetery, go in, dig up the body, remove it, put the coffin back into the grave, put the dirt back over it, and the mourners could come the next day and it would look like their loved one was still buried within that grave.
It was also traditional that they would take all the clothes off and leave the clothes in the coffin, because they believed that if they took the clothes, then they would be doing something criminal. Whereas if they just took the body out, then that wasn't committing a criminal act.
Edinburgh's surgeons knew they were buying from grave robbers. But what else could they do? They turned a blind eye to where the bodies came from. One surgeon in particular just couldn't get enough corpses. Anatomist Robert Knox, famous throughout Europe. People paid handsomely to watch him dissect a corpse.
He usually gave 2 lectures a day, one in the afternoon and a repeat session in the evening. He needed about 90 bodies a year, and he would be paying probably close to the equivalent in modern terms of about £30,000 or £40,000.
William Burke and his partner in crime, William Hare, went into the business of murder, almost by accident. The two men ran a cheap lodging house in a poor part of the city.
The first of the bodies of Burke and Hare was an individual who died of old age, but he hadn't paid his rent. And Burke and Hare decided, this seems silly. What are we going to do? We might just as well take the body to the university. The university probably paid somewhere about £10 or £15 at that time, £300 or £400 in modern terms, for a body.
The two saw a way they could get even richer by murdering their guests.
They thought, well, this is a very easy way of making decent money. And so they would find a person who they thought had no relatives, had no one who would pursue them, no one would miss them.
They would get their victim drunk on whiskey. One of them would lay across the chest and arms of the person.
The chest couldn't expand and contract, and they died very quickly of asphyxia in half a minute or a minute at the most. But what's of critical importance is there were probably very few, if any, marks on the surface of the body to say that they'd been murdered. After they'd murdered 15 or more individuals, they got extremely sloppy. One of the individuals that they were about to murder wasn't really as inebriated as they thought and shrieked, "Murder, murder."
The alarm was raised. The murderous couple were arrested.
The courts were in a dilemma because they had only circumstantial evidence and word of mouth, and there was no actual eyewitness to any of the murders.
How would prosecutors get their conviction? They promised Hare immunity if he'd testify against Burke. William Burke was on his own.
On Christmas morning, 1828, the jury deliberated for less than an hour, found Burke guilty of the murders. Burke was brought to the gallows. The crowds were enormous. The square is absolutely filled with people. Burke is then executed, and in a wonderful sense of irony, he's then brought to an anatomy classroom, dissected, and used for the good of the anatomy classes.
Were the forces of law and order any less gruesome than the killers themselves? As well as keeping Burke's skeleton as a grisly memento, surgeons wrote notes to one another in Burke's blood, noting scientifically that this blood came from his head.
Before the body was dissected, it was apparently flayed, which meant there was a lot of skin around the place. A fairly large amount of the skin disappeared. bits and pieces turn up in the form of little hard wallets and things like that, all made from the skin of Burke.
Hare escapes justice. Nobody really knows what happened to him. A popular legend is that he was accosted by an angry mob, thrown into a lime pit, and became a blind beggar on the streets of London.
The sensational crimes of the Edinburgh body snatchers had one positive result. Burke and Hare put British body snatchers out of business.
Parliament put in power the first Anatomy Act, and people who had no relatives, who died in hospital, where there was no one to look after the cost of the body, those bodies could be supplied to anatomists or to surgeons. And this is why from about 1832 onwards, the situation was completely transformed.
What other uses might there be for bodies? Plenty. Like a scene from some nightmare, this man toiled away, building elaborate decorations out of human bones.
He covered the walls and the ceilings and the eaves and the chairs and the floor with bones.
Prague, the capital of the Czech Republic, nowadays attracts thousands of visitors, keen to experience this city's sense of history, stretching back to the Middle Ages. But in those times, many centuries past, this is where most people wanted to be. A small church just north of the capital city, in a town called Kutná Hora. They came in their tens of thousands, and all of them were dead.
It was just another monastery churchyard until one of the abbots of the 13th century made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to the spot that is reputed to be the exact spot where Christ was crucified. He packed up a few barrels of earth from that site and he brought it home with him and scattered it in the cemetery. This made it enormously popular because people could then be buried in the Holy Land without actually going there. People came from literally hundreds of miles around to be buried in this cemetery.
The abbot's plan had worked, much too well. Before long, the chapel yard was filled to overflowing. Before someone was buried, someone else had to be exhumed.
They used to dig people up and store the bones. By 1870, though, they were absolutely jam-packed with bones. They had the bones of over 40,000 people, what to do. And then someone had a brilliant idea. They commissioned a local carpenter, wood carver, named Franciszek Rindt, to decorate the chapel. Well, wood's kind of expensive, so he decided to use some bones. And he sort of just got into the feel of it.
The craftsman grew ever more ambitious, his designs ever more ingenious and elaborate. But then, he had plenty of raw materials and still plenty of space to cover. His masterpiece is this coat of arms in honor of local nobility, the Schwarzenbergs. The carpenter depicts a victory in battle, with a crow plucking out the eye of one of the vanquished enemy. The bones themselves are a vivid reminder of these violent times. The carpenter had to discard some damaged skulls because they bore the wounds of battle, though he put them to one side as curiosities. This one was pierced by arrows. Another shows how a sword sliced into the victim's head. This person probably survived after surgeons removed the splintered bone. This person certainly didn't survive, but still achieved their dying wish of being buried in holy ground if only on a temporary basis. Finally, carpenter František Rindt either ran out of time or ran out of ideas. With the remaining skeletons, he built these huge structures and then signed off, quite literally. He chose rib and finger bones to spell out his name, like the artist he surely was. It mattered so much to those who came here, what happened after they died. But is that so unusual? Let's fast forward 700 years to find out how a hell-raising rock star demanded that he depart this world in a pagan ritual way out in the desert. Live fast, die young, like rock singer Gram Parsons, and you're halfway to becoming a legend already.
The problem with Gram Parsons' legacy is that he's perceived as less a musical icon, which he should be, and more of a James Dean figure.
In showbiz legend, no one ever made a grander exit than Gram Parsons, lead singer with 60s rock heroes, the Byrds. Whenever the rock and roll lifestyle got too much, Gram had a secret hideaway, here in the Joshua Tree Desert. Just a small motel in the middle of nowhere.
This was Gram Parsons' home away from home. He always had to have room 8, and all of his friends would come for the weekend, and they would write music, they would jam, they would do whatever they wanted to do.
This was where Gram and his gang would chill out in the desert heat.
Gram's life in Hollywood would have been loud and noisy and colorful and go, go, go. And the desert is very quiet, is very beige, is very slow, and is very soft. And it would have been a wonderful place for him to retire and relax.
Gram loved the desert, loved it so much that he and one of his closest pals, Phil Kaufman, made a secret vow.
They had this sort of drunken pact, as buddies do, saying, if I die, buddy, you know, you hit the guy in the shoulder, you're going to take my body and burn it in the desert. And he says, that's right, pal, and if I die, slap him on the shoulder, you're going to take my body and go out to the desert and burn it. And who would have thought that someone would die within just a few short weeks?
There was another reason why Gram liked the desert: the privacy of room 8.
It was a place away from the police departments that they could drink and indulge in drugs. But the very last time he went out there, they were having a bit of a party to celebrate the release of his last album, The Return of the Grievous Angel. And alas, that last party was the one that he overindulged and he died.
What happened next ensured Gram's place in rock folklore. Through an alcohol haze, Gram's buddies worked out a crazy scheme to honor that sacred pledge. But time was running out. Gram's body had already been shipped to LA International Airport, en route to New Orleans. What were they to do?
They rented a hearse, they went to LAX, took the coffin, put it in the back of the hearse, drove out to the desert, drinking and smoking marijuana on the way. They took it as far as they could, probably because they'd had so much alcohol on the drive out, they really couldn't go any farther. They had a brief ceremony and ignited it. Of course, they were using kerosene, so the body didn't actually burn, it exploded. They they were tracked down and they were arrested, but they were fined a few $100s apiece for desecrating a part of a national forest. And that was it. They were off scot-free. There was no law on the books, on the California state statutes, for stealing a body and taking it somewhere and setting it on fire. There was nothing they could be charged with.
It was the rock and roll farewell to end them all. It's ensured Graham's lasting fame and turned this desert motel into some kind of shrine. Every year, hundreds of fans check into Room 8 to stay in the same room where Graham died. They leave mementos and messages. Maybe there's a lesson there for other would-be rock icons. If you die young, be sure to go out in a blaze of glory. These hippie hellraisers have become a part of rock legend. But amazing as it may seem, why, their exploits are pretty tame compared with this gentleman. The Doctor, who brought about a revolution in how we deal with the dead. William Price was a surgeon practicing medicine in South Wales in the 19th century. And William Price was definitely one of a kind. The fox skin, which he wore on his head, was just the least of his eccentricities.
He was considered deeply eccentric, but on the other hand, you could say he was a very significant pioneer as well. He was a vegetarian, a Democrat. He believed in free love. He had a succession of lady friends and children from several of them. And he also believed in homeopathic medicine, which is a very modern thing by our standards today.
But the Doctor's main obsession was with death. He believed that to bury a corpse was positively dangerous. They should be burned instead.
He was a doctor, of course. He'd lived through the cholera epidemic and realized how diseases spread through people drinking tainted water, much of which drained from graveyards.
They were overcrowded, they were diseased, they were bacteria-ridden places, and it was attracting rats and vermin. So he thought that it was a more hygienic way of disposing of a body.
The problem was, cremation at that time was illegal, outlawed on religious grounds.
It's in most of the creeds. I believe in the resurrection of the body. But could you resurrect the body if the body had been burnt?
This is the house where William Price lived, and where a tragedy in his own life brought him up against the law. The Doctor had a baby son, who, true to his father's eccentric ways, had been formally christened Jesus Christ Price. But the baby fell ill. Soon the Doctor would put theory into practice.
Little Jesus Christ Price died, and instead of an inquest being held, William Price decided to take his disposal, the disposal of his son's body, into his own hands.
He took him, Jesus Christ, carrying him in his arms. People began to look around, you know, what is he up to? Is the child really dead? Is he sacrificing him?
But nothing and nobody was going to stop the Doctor putting his plan into action.
The townsfolk saw this happening. I guess you couldn't really burn a child's body without a lot of people raising an eyebrow. They thought that he'd murdered the kid. It was proven that the child died of natural causes, but he was still put on trial for just trying to dispose of a body that way, because at that point it was illegal.
The Doctor was put on trial in the Welsh capital, Cardiff. The case was a sensation. Had the Doctor gone too far this time?
Hold it, Price! Hold it, Price! Dr. Price, how do you plead? not guilty.
The court came to the conclusion that although the law doesn't say you can cremate a body, there's no law saying you can't either.
This court is adjourned. Thank you, my lord.
He was actually acquitted of it. And then that was what made cremation, the whole cremation process, become legalized. It was through William Price's eccentricity that, that this had happened.
Had this brush with the law changed Dr. Price in any way? Not a bit.
Well, he not only named one son Jesus Christ, after Jesus Christ the first, so to speak, died, he took up with a young woman and he had another son and he called him Jesus Christ the second.
And how would William Price leave this world? Well, how else?
Thousands came to his own cremation. They knew that when the man himself was going to go to kingdom come, that would be worth seeing.
Newspapers eagerly reported the event for those who couldn't be there. William Price was one of those rare beings, a legend in his own lifetime, remembered in Wales by this statue, as if anyone could forget him. He was a legend with an important legacy.
We have a more hygienic way of disposing of bodies. And for that reason, I think we've got reason to praise William Price and respect his memory.
The problem of how best to dispose of the dead has haunted every culture in every age. In one city in particular, that problem needed solving. A city that was built on the edge of a swamp. New Orleans.
Above-ground burial in New Orleans was a necessity. We had a very high water table. The water would fill a 6-foot hole and the body would float back up. We went to above-ground burial to alleviate that problem.
And so there developed these ornate cities of the dead. The oldest of them, St. Louis Cemetery.
There are many styles of tombs and very ornate society tombs that groups would gather together, their funds, and they'd be able to reduce funereal costs for its members. And you'll see the decorated fences, which were not only originally thought to contain the bodies, but it was also known to contain the spirits.
People visit St. Louis Cemetery not just for the architecture, but to pay tribute at one tomb in particular. Marie Laveau was the 19th century voodoo queen, credited with the power to foretell the future, to talk with the dead.
The grave of Marie Laveau is the #1 visited spot in New Orleans still to this very day. It's considered a shrine by many. It's a wishing ritual that you can do at the tomb where her spirit will intervene to help you get what you need. Knocking 3 times is to open the gates, to call on the spirit. You'd make the ancient voodoo crosses, the X's, out of an element of nature like brick dust. Leave offerings for Marie Laveau, pray and meditate, and eventually close the gates, and asking permission to call again. Creole voodoo is as unique as the city herself. The most unique thing was that it was the Mama Loy, the queen, the priestess, who was the spiritual leader. It was predominantly female, and there was no leader better than Marie Laveau.
Nowadays, is it much more than a tourist trap? Maybe not, though it's a reminder of an age when belief in magic flourished, before science provided all the answers. When people needed an explanation for otherwise inexplicable events, then the supernatural was often invoked. Voodoo reached New Orleans from the Caribbean islands. And it's on one of those islands, inside this burial vault, almost 200 years ago, that there began one of the most enduring burial mysteries of all time. The island of Barbados, set like an emerald in the Caribbean Sea, famous nowadays for its white sand, its palm-fringed beaches. But in 1812, this island achieved fame and notoriety for something quite different. When darkness came on this paradise island, Something was raising hell. Barbados was an outpost of the British Empire. The small town of Christchurch, home to many wealthy plantation owners. The parish church is where generations of them are buried.
Members of prominence within the society would have family graves and vaults. Family members laid in there like on shelves.
The Chase family were rich landowners. This was their family burial vault. With 2 members of the Chase family already buried there, in 1816, another family member died. It was later that same year that a cousin of the Chase family, Samuel Brewster, died. Preparations were made for his interment.
When the vault is open, while there's a great disturbance and concern because the coffins have been moved.
This is what they found inside the vault. Though it had been sealed with a heavy stone slab, coffins and bodies were strewn everywhere. Islanders were alarmed, but there seemed no explanation for the horrible desecration. The vault was tidied, Samuel Brewster's coffin placed alongside the others. It was 3 years before the vault was opened again for another family burial. To their horror, this was how the vault looked now. Something had to be done. The governor of Barbados, Lord Combermere, decided to investigate. The governor's wife, Lady Combermere, recorded the event in her journal.
The walls, when examined, proved to be perfectly secure. No passage or entrance was concealed.
The governor ordered that a trap be laid to detect any future intruders.
The floor was spread with fine white sand, in the presence of His Lordship and the assembled crowd.
Finally, the governor made secret marks in the sand, which only he could recognize. Then he ordered that the vault be sealed once again, and a guard was placed outside. 9 months later, the governor ordered that the vault be re-examined. Whoever or whatever had desecrated the vault a 3rd time had done it without leaving footprints or disturbing the governor's secret signs in any way. So what had caused the desecration? There are many theories. Perhaps a buildup of explosive gases from bodies decomposing in the tropical heat. Or is there some supernatural explanation?
Some would have wondered whether it's witchcraft. Some would have wondered whether there's zombies. No, I don't believe there's a supernatural force at work. Hopefully, Christian and spiritual forces.
No one knows the answer. After the final desecration, the coffins were removed and buried elsewhere. Today, the Chase Vault stands empty, or at least empty of things we can see. Don't we all hope, when the final curtain falls, when our time comes, that we'll know eternal rest? The record shows that may be a false hope. Sometimes it's the dead who haunt the living. Sometimes the living who haunt the dead. Either way, when that divide between life and death is breached, then trouble's guaranteed. Our survey shows that too often the sanctity of death is denied, when the dead should be resting in peace, but when someone, something, is intent on raising hell.